In this video, you will learn how to build a to-do list with such features like deleting, editing, and creating by using Angular signals. And the project that we want to build is called Todo MVC. As you can see here, I opened the website todomvc.com, and here you can see examples in different front-end languages. And here is how our project is looking like. We have here a header, to-dos, and just an input. And we can type something here. After we are hitting enter, we see our to-do here on the bottom, and we can directly add one more to-do. As you can see, we have here cross on the right, so we can remove the to-do, or on the left we can select the to-do and then it is marked as completed. After we marked at least one item, we can see on the bottom one item left, and here different filters like all, active, completed. We can click here on active and we can see all items which are not completed yet. On completed we see only completed items, and we can click here clear completed, and then we have just one item left because all our completed items are removed. Additionally to that, we have a double click here and we can update our item. This is exactly the project that we want to implement inside Angular by using Angular signals. And here I already generated for us an empty Angular application. I don't have anything here inside app, it is just an empty HTML and an empty app component, but most importantly we have here styles CSS. And here I have lots of styles which are directly from this to-do project. As you can see, here are classes like to-do app h1, new to-do, edit, and so on. Obviously you don't need to retype it, you can just take it from the description box below. So first of all, here let's create a new folder for our huge feature. Inside app I want to create a folder which will be called to-dos, and this is exactly the whole feature that we want to implement with the list, filtering, and editing. And inside to-dos directly I want to create our new component because it is a standalone component. Here is our to-dos component ts and to-dos component html. Now inside I will simply write to-dos so we can check if our component is working, and here inside ts file we must generate a new component. And first of all, here let's provide a selector, for example app to-dos, because my project is named app. Then we need here a template URL for the file that we just created, to-dos component HTML, and we must say that this is a standalone component. This is why standalone true. After this, I want to export our new class, which is a to-dos component. Now, in order to test that, we must register it inside our app component. This is why I am jumping inside app component ts, and inside our imports, I want to add here to-dos component. Without this line, we can't really render our component. But now I can jump inside HTML and just render here our app to-dos component. Let's check if it's working. I don't have any errors in the console, and inside browser here on the top you can see a single word to-dos, which actually means we successfully registered our to-dos component and rendered it inside our project. What I want to do next, I want to split our feature in different components because I want to keep it separated. And what I want to create here is first of all a header, then a footer that we have here on the bottom, then main part, and probably a component for a single to-do, which actually means for this we must create 4 additional components. This is why here I want to copy to-dos folder completely, and now inside app to-dos we want a new folder which is called components. Here we will store all child components of our to-dos feature. This is why inside components we can paste and rename this folder, and first of all I want to create here a header folder. Now inside this header folder we must rename our to-dos component to header component and HTML file to header component HTML. Now inside I want to render our header word and just change our component. So here we will have a selector app to-dos header because this is a child component, and the template URL here will be header component HTML. This is also a standalone component, but the class here will be header component. Our first component is fully ready. Now I just want to copy paste it completely and rename to the footer. This is exactly what we want to render on the bottom. So here again it will be footer component HTML and footer component ts. Now inside our HTML we can just write footer, and we must update our component. So here we will have not header but footer, and here will be footer component HTML, and the name will be footer component. And the last thing that we need here is our main component. This is why I want to paste and rename header to the main and just update the names. So here will be main component HTML and main component TS. Now let's just change our HTML to main and update our TS file. It will be app to dos main. Here is our main component HTML and our component is called main component. So all our components are ready. Now we must register all of them inside our to-dos component TS. This is why here inside our imports we can register all these components. First of all, it is header component, then footer component, and then main component. And now we can render them directly inside our HTML. So just for testing, I will write here app, then to-dos. Here we have header. Let's close our app to-dos header. Then I will copy paste it and just change to main. And on the bottom we have our footer. Let's check if it's working. We don't have any errors. And as you can see inside browser, we're rendering 3 different components: header, main, and footer, which actually means we fully prepared our empty components. The next thing that I want to prepare is the interface, because we are talking here about to-dos and it makes a lot of sense to create such entity inside our application. And in order to do that inside our app to-dos, I want to create a new folder and it is types. And inside types, we will store all interfaces or types or enums which are related to our feature. This is why here I want to create to-do interface TS. And here is just a single to-do, how it must look like. And then we will reuse this interface everywhere. So we want to export here an interface, and it is a to-do interface. And it has several things. First of all, it is ID, it must be a string, then a text, this is a content of our to-do, and the last one is completed. And is completed must be boolean, which actually means when we complete a to-do, we must change is completed property to true. And now we're coming to the most interesting part, it is our service. Why is that? Because essentially we will write all our signals inside the service, so actually all our components will use the same shareable service to isolate all these methods inside. This is why here inside our app to-dos, I want to create a services folder, and here we will have just a single service, to-dos service TS. And here we have an injectable service. And as it is recommended inside Angular, we want to register it with provided in root. After this, we must export this new class, which is our to-dos service. So now the question is what we're storing here. And obviously we're storing the list of our to-dos. And we want to store it with signals. This is why here I want to create to-dos property. We can even write with camel case to-dos signal, so we know that this is a signal. And here we're assigning our signal with initial value empty array. And here we must say that inside we want to store our to-do interface array, which actually means here we created a signal and it stores inside an array of our to-dos, and by default we don't have any to-dos. Now we need to create here several methods to work with our to-dos, like for example add to-do, because we want to add it to the list, remove to-do, update to-do, and so on. But here I want to start with just a single method, add to-do. And what we're getting here after we typed in the input is just text, and this is a string. And here we're returning void because it simply must update our signal. How we can do that? First of all, we must create here our new to-do, and we must say that this is our to-do interface. So in order to create that, we must throw inside our text. We know that is completed by default is false, but the most interesting is ID. We don't have a way to generate a unique ID. This is why I will simply use here math random, and after this to string 16. And this is how our string will look like. It is fine for our needs, but obviously in the real project you will make an API call to the backend and it will generate for you an ID. For our case, this is completely fine. We generated a new to-do and now we must push it to our to-do signal. In order to do that, we can use a method which is called update, and we're calling it on our signal, and inside we're providing a function which will update our elements inside. Which actually means here we are getting inside function our to-dos that we already have, and now we must return a new array of to-dos. This is why I am spreading all our to-dos, and at the end I want to push our new to-do. Which actually means with a single liner we updated our signal with new data. And as you can see here, update method updates a value of the signal based on its current value and notify all dependents. This is exactly what we want. Now I want to start implementing our header, but in order to do that we must change a little bit our todos component HTML. It is actually completely fine, but we must wrap it with an additional class. So here will be div class todo app, and we need it because the whole CSS is written with this parent class. But all this stuff is staying the same. Now let's implement the logic inside our header. This is why I am jumping inside our components, header HTML, and this is what we need to implement. Our header is just this part that you can see here and the input that we are changing. This is why let's write exactly this. Here we have our header with class header, and inside our header we have h1 tag. And this h1 tag is todos. And after this we have our input, where we will type everything. And most importantly is our class new todo. After this we also have a placeholder, which is what needs to be done. We also have here autofocus. This is exactly this autofocus feature. After this we must provide a value, and here we must create a value text. I will create it in a second. And also we need here an event after changing the input. This is why here we have a key up. And let's name it, for example, change text, where inside we're providing our event. And last but not least is keyup.enter. This is our enter, which will happen only when we want to add a to-do. This is why here we have an add to-do method. So again, we created here our value, which we must create, and we have two events, change text, where we're changing this property text, and add to-do, where we're adding a to-do. Now let's implement on the right exactly that. Here is our header component, and first of all we need here text. It is a string, and by default it is an empty string. Now here we want our change text function, which we created on the left with keyup event. And we're getting here event, which is an event, and we're returning here void. What we want to do here, we want to get a correct target. And actually here we must convert it and say that this is an input. This is why here we're writing that event.target as HTML input element. And in this case we told TypeScript that our target is an input. This is why here now we can write this text equal target.value. Because in this case our target is HTML input element and it has a value. Which actually means every single time when we have a keyup event, we change our text. Now we must implement a to-do function, but the main point is that we want to inject our service here in order to use it. This is why here we want on the top to inject our to-do service that we just created, and here we're using inject function in order to inject inside our to-do service. So with this single liner our to-do service is available for us inside this component. So here after change text we can create a to-do function. And here we're returning void, and we simply want to call our service. This is this to-do service.addTodo, and we're providing inside our text. And our text is inside this.text, which actually means with this single liner from any place of our application, we can add a new to-do to our signal. And after this, what we want to do, we want to reset our text. This is why this text equals an empty string. Let's check if it's working. As you can see here, we don't have any errors. Let's look in browser. So here you can see that our headline is there. We have our input, what needs to be done. I can type something and hit enter, and the text disappears, and now we can type again. And actually it didn't just disappear, it went to our signal, but obviously we didn't render a value from the signal yet. Which means now we must implement our main section to render there our to-dos. So let's jump inside our component main inside HTML, and here we want some markup. What we want here is a section with class main, and inside we have a UL with class to-do list. And what we want to render inside is to-dos from our service. This is why here on the right inside main component we want to get access to our service. This is why here to-do service, and we're injecting it with to-do service. As you can see here, if we're using our this to-do service, we have full access to our to-do signal, which actually means we can use it directly inside our HTML. This is why here what I want to do on the left, I want to render a list with our signal from the service. So here let's just write a div with ng for loop, and we're looping to create a to-do of to-dos, and we're getting them from our to-do service dot, and here we have our to-dos signal. And actually we must write here round brackets because this is a signal, and this is how we're reading the value from the signal. Now here inside we can just render like normally to-do.text. Let's check if it's working. As you can see here, we're getting a warning because we used ng for directive, but we didn't inject common module inside our component. This is why here on the right we must import common module so it will work correctly. As you can see now everything is green and we don't have any error. Let's jump to the browser, and here I will try to type something and hit enter. And as you can see now we're getting these to-dos which are directly added inside our main section, which actually means every single time when we're submitting the input, our to-do is pushed to the signals, and now inside main we're subscribing to this signal and we're rendering information from it. This is exactly how we typically use signals inside our application. We're packing them inside the service and we can use them everywhere. But now it is time to make it more complicated. Just to remind you, inside our to-do MVC on the bottom we have 3 different filters, all, active and completed, which actually means we must implement somehow filters inside our application. So first of all, what I want to do is generate the enum for our filters. In this case, we can understand directly what filters are possible for us. This is why inside app to-dos types, we can create a new enum. And let's name it filter enum ts. Now here let's export our enum, which is filter enum. And here we have 3 different enums. First of all, it is all. This is just a string all. Then we have active, which is just a string active. And we have completed, and this is a string completed. And what we want to do now, we want to activate some filter, which actually means at all times we have some filter activated. This is why inside our services, to-do service, we can create a new signal just for filter. This is why here I will create filter signal, and this is just a signal where inside we can write only filter enum that we just created, and by default the value here will be filter enum dot all, which actually means we are showing all our to-dos. So our filter is there, and now we can use it for logic inside main TS. This is why here I will jump directly inside main component TS, and here I want to create a property visible to-dos. Why is that? Because as you can see here inside the example, we have different visible to-dos based on what filter is activated. This is not how we rendered elements for now, because we simply rendered all our elements from the to-do signal, and this is wrong. This is why here inside main TS, I want to use the filter to write correct logic. And in order to do that, we must use computed. So what is computed? We can, based on some signals, calculate some new signal. This is exactly what computed is used for. So here I want to create visible to-dos, which is a property which will hold just to-dos, which must be rendered on the screen now with current filter. And we're using for this computed function. And inside we provide just a function, and we can use inside several signals. First of all, here we want to get to-do signal, and this is this to-do service, our to-do signal. And here we also want to create our filter, and this is our this to-do service dot filter signal. And as you can see, I'm using here round brackets because we just need to read the value, which actually means we have directly here the list of our to-dos and the filter which is active. This is why here we can write now logic what to-dos we want to show based on this filter. So here we are checking if our filter equals filter enum dot active, it means that we need to filter out only active to-dos. This is why here I want to return our to-dos filter, and we're getting access to every single to-do, and we want to know that our to-do is not completed, which actually means with this line we're returning only active to-dos. Now here we must write one more check for our filter, and here we want to check if our filter enum equals completed. In this case we want to show only completed to-dos, and this is exactly the same logic but without exclamation mark. It is just to-do is completed. And if all these cases are not valid, then here we want to just return our to-dos as it is without any filtering. This is our default case. And as you can see, what we're getting back is our signal of to-do interface array, but now this is a visible to-dos. It is computed based on these two signals, to-dos and filter. So now here we can jump back inside our HTML, and instead of this code we can simply write visible to-dos with round brackets. As you can see in browser, it looks exactly the same like previously, but now we used the filter logic inside. Which actually means it is a nice time to implement our footer because we have filter change there. This is why here I want to jump inside our to-dos components. Here is our footer and HTML. Now let's write markup for our footer. So here we will have footer with class footer, and inside we will have our filters. This is by UL with class filters. Let's close our UL and create inside a li. And inside li we want to create a href, which is a slash. And here we want to create ng class. Why ng class? Because we want to apply here a selected class when this particular item is selected. This is why here we're applying selected class where this logic works. And this is filter equals filter_enum.all. And now here I want to close our A, and inside we're writing all. Now the question is, what is filter and what is filter_enum? We must create them inside TS file. And in order to do that, we must inject our to-do service inside this component. So here is inject to-do service, and we want to get a filter. And in order to get a filter like a readable value, we can write this.to-do service, and here is our filter signal with round brackets. As you can see now, we are getting back a filter_enum. This is exactly what we need. And additionally to that, we want to read a filter_enum inside our HTML. This is why we must create it as a local property inside our footer component. As you can see here, we don't get any errors. I can jump in browser and we see here our all filter, which is activated because it is selected by default. Now let's create two more links. This is why here I will copy paste this link completely, and we want to change our logic. So here we want to highlight the link only for active elements, and now we're showing here active elements, and here we have filter completed, and the filter_enum here is completed. As you can see in browser, all these filters are there, and now we must create the logic to activate them. This is why here for every single filter I want to create a click event, and here will be a function change filter, where inside we must provide what we're changing. As this is a href, we want to use prevent default. This is why I will pass here an event, but also filter_enum.all. And the same click we must attach for every single A. So here filter_enum will be active, and for the last one it will be completed. And now we must create this change filter function inside our footer component. So here is change filter, and we know that we're getting event, which is an event, and we're getting a filter name. And this is our filter_enum that we already prepared. And inside this function does not return anything, but first of all we want to call event prevent default, because this is a link, and secondly we want to change the filter. But we don't have such method inside our service, we must create it. This is why on the right I will open our service, which is to-do service, and here on the top I want to create a function which is change filter, and here we can get a filter name inside, which will be our filter_enum, and it returns for us void, but inside we just want to update our filter signal. And in order to do that we can use this filter signal.set, and we are setting here our filter name. And as you can see, we used here not update like here, but set. And what set does, it overrides completely the value of the signal. This is exactly what we want. Now here inside our change filter, we can directly call our service. And this is this to-do service.changeFilter, where inside we're providing our filter name. Which actually means with this single line, we're updating a filter inside our service, and it will update all our components which are listening for this change of the filter. But as you can see, we're clicking on the active button and nothing happens. Why is that? Because essentially this line changed the signal inside our service, but this line where we read our filter signal just did it once. And we can easily check that. I will paste the console log after our change filter. So this is after change filter. And here what I want to check is this to-do service dot filter signal with round brackets. This is how we are reading the value from the signal. Let's have a look. I'm clicking on the active and we're getting after change filter active, which actually means we have a correct filter inside our signal, but the value of the filter here is wrong. And it is wrong because we read it only once and it is not a signal anymore. This is why here the correct way to do it is to write that this is a filter signal and here remove round brackets. In this case here it is still a signal from our service. And now we must jump back inside our HTML and in all places instead of filter we're writing filter signal with round brackets. And in this case it will work because it listens to the signal and not just from the value that we set once. Let's have a look. Now I'm clicking on the active and as you can see it updated correctly because the problem was not in our service but in our component which was not listening for the changes of our signal. As you can see our filters are there but we're missing on the left the count of our to-dos that we have. This is why here what I want to do inside our footer, I want to create one more computed property. And here we can name it active count, which will show how many active to-dos we have. And we can assign here computed and we want to provide inside a function and use a to-do signal to get the amount of active elements. This is why here we can return this to-do service and here we have our to-do signals with round brackets. So we're getting here a list of our to-dos and we want to filter them and get only active. So to-do must be not completed. And at the end we must use length because we want to know the total amount of our active items. So here now we can jump inside our HTML and before our filters we want to create a span with class toDoCount. And now inside this span we can create strong element and render inside a value active count with round brackets because this is a signal. As you can see we don't have any errors and here we're getting 0 on the screen. Now when we're adding several to-dos you can see that our counter is 3 now, which actually means our computed property is working correctly. The only thing that we're missing here on the footer is an additional class, but we must apply this class hidden, so we should not show footer if we don't have any items, which actually means here we want to create one more computed property. So here let's create a noToDos class, which is either true or false, and we're using here computed. And here we want to return a function where we're checking this to-do service and here is our to-do signal and we want to check that its length is 0. In this case we're getting noToDos class. And now here inside our HTML we can add it to hide the whole footer. So we need here ngClass and we want to apply here a class which is called hidden and here we're calling noToDos class signal. As you can see no errors here. Now when we're reloading the page we don't see our footer at all because it is hidden. And the last thing that we're missing inside our footer is the text regarding how many items we have. Here we have a counter but no text. And text we also must prepare as a computed. So here we can create items left text. And here we're using our computed property and inside we have a function where we're returning a string. And here we're writing item and then a variable. And here I want to use ternary operator to check if we need plural form or not. And we're checking here if our active count does not equal 1, which means it is bigger, then we're returning here s. In other case we're returning here an empty string. Then we have here a space and word left. So essentially here inside we will have a string either items or item left. Let's apply it inside our HTML. So here after our active count, we just need to render a property items left text with round brackets. And as you can see in browser now, when we will create our to-do, we're getting 1 item left. If we have more than 1 item, then we're getting 2 items left, which actually means we successfully implemented our footer. The next thing that I want to implement is a single to-do. By now we simply rendered inside our main HTML text inside visible to-dos. This is not enough because we want to implement editing and removing and the whole to-do, and it makes a lot of sense to create an additional component for it. This is why here I want to create a new folder which is called to-do, and inside we need 2 things. First of all our component ts and secondly component html. Now here inside our main HTML, instead of to-do text, we want to call a component app todos to do, and we simply close it here. And actually we can move this in G4 on this component because we don't need this additional div. Additionally to that, we want to provide inside a to-do that we're getting when we're looping through. Now here we can directly remove this text and this div, we don't need it anymore. So let's implement this to-do component. I want to jump back inside our to-do component TS, and here I want to register our component where we have our selector, which will be app todos to do. And here we also need to provide a template URL that we just created. Also, obviously we want standalone true, and here we want to export our class, which will be our to-do component. Now here we already know that inside we are passing a to-do. This is why here we can create an input and we can say that it is required. This is why required true. And here we are saying to-do with exclamation mark. It means that TypeScript won't tell us that this input is not provided, because we are sure with required that we always provide it. And we must say that this is a to-do interface, which we will use inside. Now let's write the markup, and inside our HTML, first of all we have here a li, and then inside we have a div with class view. Let's close this div, and inside we will have a label with our text of the to-do, and it will be in our case todo.text. As you can see, we are getting an error that app todos to do is not a known element. And it happens because we must register inside our main TS, inside our imports to-do component that we just created. Now we don't have any errors, let's jump in browser. Here I am adding a to-do, and now as you can see it is rendered much nicer because it is isolated inside a component and we added here some classes. The next thing that we need to implement is editing of this specific to-do. And in order to do that, we must store somewhere an editing ID, because we only can change a single to-do. This is why here I want inside main component store a variable with the editing ID. So here on the top, for example, we can create editing ID and it is either string or null, and by default it must be null, which actually means we're storing inside editing ID the ID of the to-do when we edit it. And additionally to that, we must create here a function set editing ID, because we want to call it from our HTML. So here inside we're getting editing ID and it is obviously a string or null. Why null? Because it might happen that we want to close the editing form without submitting, and then we need to provide a null inside. This is why here we must return void, and we simply want to update our property editing ID with editing ID that we got. Now we can jump directly inside our HTML and provide inside every single to-do an editing ID. But we can do better, we can directly provide here is editing, and then every single element knows if we are editing this component or not. This is why here I am just comparing editing ID, this is our property inside this, with to-do ID inside the loop. In this case here we're providing inside the value is editing and not just editing ID. Additionally to that, we must call here set editing ID because we want to call it from the inside. This is why here set editing ID that we just created, and we will pass it from to-do component itself. So let's go back to our to-do component, and here we know that we are getting one more input and it is required. This is where required true, and we know that we have is editing, also with exclamation mark, and it is a boolean. Now we can use this property inside our HTML here on the li. We must create here ng class and we want to set here editing class. And actually, if our property is editing is true, then we want to set this class. And obviously we must wrap it in double quotes. So here we rendered our view, it is always there, but additionally to that, in the editing mode, we want to render a specific block. This is why here I will write ng container, and let's close our ng container. And inside I will write ng if is editing, which actually means this block is there only when we are in the editing state. And what we want here is an input. And we need here an input with class edit. We are providing inside a value, and what is our value? This is our editing text, and we don't have it yet. Also here we need a keyup event, just like we did previously, and here we will have change text function, for example, also with event, and also the submit here is keyup with .enter. and it will be our change to do, for example. Which actually means here we are binding a value, we will create it in a second, we also have a key up event and submitting to change the to-do. Now here on the right, let's open our to-do component, and here what we want to do is create editing text. And we can say that this is a string, and by default it is an empty string, because at this moment we didn't receive our inputs yet. This is why here we must write implements on init, and we must write the logic to set our inputs inside our ng on init. So here inside ng on init we can write this editing text equals this .todo.text. In this case here we're updating our editing text, and now we can change it inside our input without modifying the to-do itself. Now here we must also create change text, which must update this property. So we're getting here an event which is of type event, and again we want to get our value. In order to get a value, we're reading event.target as HTML input element. And we know that we have a property value on it. And after this we can simply assign this value property to our editing text. So this was our change text, and also we must create change to do, which will update it. And actually this is the submitting of our input, and we want two things. First of all, we want to close our editing state. We can do that with the output. Just to remind you, inside our main, inside HTML, we have set editing ID. This is exactly what we need here now. We need to register here our output, and we have here set editing ID function, and we know that this is an event emitter with either string or null. And here we are calling new event emitter with round brackets. And now here what it does, this is just an output, so we can tell main what we want to do with editing ID. And in this case here, inside our change to do, we want to call set editing ID with emit and provide inside null, which actually means we simply close it. Let's check if it's working. We have here an error cannot bind to ng class. Again, it happens because here we must import common module. As you can see, we don't have errors. Let's check in browser. Here I can add an input, but we can't really jump inside editing mode. We must implement a double click on this value, and then our editing mode will be activated. This is why here let's open an HTML of to do, and here we have our label. What we want to do on our label, we want a double click event, and we need to call something like set to do in edit mode. Let's jump back to our TS file and create this function. And what this function does, it simply emits the ID through set editing ID. So we're calling here emit, and we're providing inside this todo.id, which actually means we're saying, okay, inside main, we must store now the ID of this to do as editing ID. As you can see, we don't have errors. Let's add here a to do and double click on it. And as you can see, voila, we're getting here an input. How it happened? We made a double click, we set this property inside main. Now main gave us is editing property as true for this specific to do, and we rendered this input. And inside we got the value, which is there through our editing text. Now here we can change it and hit enter, and this value will be submitted. This is why we are not in editing mode anymore. Which actually means everything worked, but we didn't update this property at all inside our service, inside the array of signals. And in order to do that, we must create a new method inside our to-do service. So we need here something like change to do, and we're getting here an ID. This is a to do that we want to update, and text, which will be new for our to do. Here we're returning void, and we must update this to do inside our signal. So here will be this to do signal.update, and we're getting access to all our to dos. Now here what we can do, we can map through every single to do, and we're getting access to the to do, and we can check that to do ID must equal the ID that we provided. And if yes, that we want to update the whole to do with new text. In other case, we want just to return a to do. Which actually means we're looping through all our to-dos, and we're updating just a to-do where ID is like we provided inside our function. So now we can jump back inside our to-do component, and here when we have change to-do, before we emit null, we can call our service. This is by here this .todo service, and as you can see, we didn't inject it here. This is by here on the top, I want to get to-do service by injecting our to-dos service. And now here on the bottom, we can call this todos service dot, and we are getting change to do. Inside, we must provide our this to do ID and the new text, and this text is inside this dot editing text. Let's check if it's working. We don't have errors. Let's jump in browser and create a to-do. Now I will double click on it and update it with 111. I'm hitting enter, and as you can see, it was modified because we updated it inside the service. Our next step is to implement removing of our to-do, and in order to do that, we must jump inside the HTML of our to-do, and after our label we have a button. So here will be button with class destroy, and here we must apply a click event with, for example, remove to do. And now let's just close this button. And just like previously, we don't have this method inside service yet. This is why here let's first create an empty remove to do method inside our to do component, and now we must jump back inside our to do service to implement deleting of the to do inside our signal. So let's call it remove to do, and we know in order to remove the to do, we must know an ID, and it is a string. Now here we're returning void, and again we will use update. This is by this to do signal dot update. We're getting access to the to dos that we have here, and we just want to filter them. So we're calling filter, we're getting access to every single to do, and we're comparing to do ID, and it should not equal the ID that we provided, which actually means we're storing all to-dos except of one with this specific ID. Now we can jump back inside our component and just call this function. This is by this to-do service, remove to-do, and we must provide an ID of the to-do inside. It is this to-do.id. Let's check if it's working. No errors here. Let's jump in browser and type something for our to-do. And now here on the right, we have on hover this cross. I can click on this cross, and as you can see directly, our to-do was removed. As you can see inside finished project, we have on the left also the check mark. And when we're clicking on here, our to-do is completed. We also must implement this logic. So in order to do that, I want to jump inside our to-do component HTML, and here before our label we can create an input with class toggle. And here the type will be checkbox. And here we have two things. First of all, we must provide checked inside, and it will be to do is completed. As we have access to the whole to do, we can directly set it on initialize. And after this, we also must create here a change event, and we can name it, for example, toggle to do. Let's close this input, and the only thing that we're missing is toggle to do function. And again, this toggle to do function must be implemented first inside our service, because we're modifying a to do inside the signal. And actually, in order to implement that, we can copy completely change to do, because we will do exactly the same stuff. We simply need to modify a value inside our to do. So here I want to name the function toggle to do, and we're providing just ID string inside, because we know we simply want to toggle our is completed. Here we're looping through all our to-dos with the map, and we're checking the to-do for this ID. And if it is this ID, what we want to do, we want to assign is completed as not is completed, and it will toggle this property. But actually it is to-do.isCompleted. Which actually means we're mapping through all our to-dos, we're checking every single to-do for this ID that we provided, and if it is this to-do, then we're overwriting is completed by toggling it. In other case, we simply return the same to-do. Now we can jump back inside our to-do component, and here we can create a function toggle to-do, where we don't get anything. Now here we're returning void, and we can simply call inside to-do service dot, and here we have our toggle to-do, where inside we must provide an ID of our to-do. Let's check if it's working. No errors here. Let's jump to browser and add a to-do. As you can see on the left, we have now a toggler, and we can click on it. And as you can see, when I clicked, now it is green, and we're getting on the footer 0 items left, which means it is all completely correct and it was modified inside our signal. The main problem is that our item is not crossed out. It happens because we must apply one more class on our li, and it is a class completed. So we're applying it only when our to-do is completed. In this case, it should work just fine. Let's check this out. We're typing you to do. I'm clicking here to complete a to-do, and now it is crossed out. But we have one more problem. When we're double-clicking on the item, we can't directly type something. We really need to focus on the field, and this is not a cool behavior. We can easily change that if we are getting access to this specific input. So we can write here hash text input, and we can just read this viewChild inside our component. So let's jump inside our TS file, and here on the top we can get access to this viewChild, where inside we're providing text input that we just attached. And this is a text input. By default it is undefined, and we're getting access to our element reference. Now here what we want to do, we want to listen for ng on changes. This is why here on changes, and here we must create ng on changes, and we want to check if our changes and property is editing dot current value, which means is editing is true, then we want to make a focus, and we must wrap it with set timeout to wait for the rendered element. And this is just a set timeout with 0, so no delay here, and we're calling this text input. We know that it might be undefined. This is $native_element.focus, which actually means every single time when we're changing is editing to true, we're coming here and we're focusing on this native element with plain JavaScript. Let's check if it's working. So here we're creating you to do, I'm activating editing, and as you can see I can type directly because we were focused on this specific input. And the last feature that we're missing is toggle all. As you can see here inside headline on the top, we have this icon, and when we're clicking on it, we're toggling all elements that we have. And essentially this icon is not inside header, it is positioned absolute from the main. This is why we must jump back inside our main, and here we must create it. So inside our section before UL, we're creating an input with ID toggle all, and also a class toggle all, and type is checkbox. And also again we're providing inside checked, where we must calculate it. This is why here I want to create something like is all to-dos selected. And again with round brackets because it must be a signal. And also we must create here a change event when we're clicking on it, and let's name it toggle all to-dos. And inside we're providing an event. And after our input we want to create a label with text for, and here will be toggle all as our ID element. Because essentially our input won't be visible, we will see just label, and we will click on the label. And inside I will write mark all as completed. So now we must create this computed property and this change event. Let's jump inside our TS file and create first of all computed property. So we want here is all to do selected computed property. We're using here a computed function, and we're providing a function inside. So we want to check here this to-do service, and we want to access all our to-dos, so to-do signal with round brackets. And we're calling here every because we want to know that every single to-do here is completed, so to-do is completed. Which actually means this signal will return for us a boolean, and it will be true when all our to-dos are completed. And additionally here we must create a function toggle all to-dos, where we're getting inside an event of type event. Back we're getting our void, and inside we just want to read a target. This is why here to read a target we must convert event target as HTML input element. Now here we must call a service method toggle all, and we didn't implement it yet. This is why let's jump back to our to-do service, and here on the bottom we can implement a function toggle all. And inside we're providing is completed, which is either true or false, which means it is boolean. Back we're returning void, and what we want to do is simply update every single element, which means we can simply copy paste this update with map. This is totally fine. And we want to update every single to-do here with inverted is completed. So we don't need this check, we simply return a merge to-do with this completed property where we're assigning this is completed, which actually means we're simply updating every single element inside our array. Now let's jump back inside our main component TS and call here this service. It will be this dot to-do service dot, and here we have a function now toggle all, where inside we must provide is completed. And what is completed in our case? It is started.checked, because this is a checkbox. Let's check if it's working. We don't have any errors. Let's jump here. As you can see, we already have this icon. I can type something here to add several to-dos, and I want to click on it. And as you can see, all our to-dos were toggled directly. Now we're clicking again, and they are all active again. The only thing that we're missing is no to-dos class, just like we had inside our footer. This is why here we can jump inside footer and simply copy-paste it. I want to take this no to-dos class and create it here inside main. And essentially, as you can see, this is the same code in two different components. We could move it to our service. So now I want to jump inside our main component HTML, and here we have class main, but we also want ng class here to apply one more class, and it will be hidden, where we will call no to-dos class with round brackets, which actually means we're hiding our main part if we don't have any to-dos. Let's check this out. We don't see anything except of the input. We're typing something, and now we see our main part. We can click here and toggle one to-do, and now we're clicking on completed filter, and as you can see, it highlights only completed items. Now we're clicking on the active, and we see just active items, which actually means we successfully implemented this to-do list with signals. And if you're interested to know how to implement exactly the same to-do list without signals but with RxJS and plain Angular, make sure to check this video also.